Okay, thanks for inviting me. So this is actually based on a paper that I'm writing on consumption inequality with Orazio Tanasi for the Journal of Economic Perspective. I'm going to give you kind of a brief summary. And I'm not going to talk about the SPM, but like a bit more broadly about how should we measure poverty and inequality. And as you know, much of the debate is phrased in terms of income, or components of income like wages of earnings. But for economists, we have individuals who maximize utility, and utility is defined over consumption and other items like leisure, for example. And so the theme of the paper of this research is that even if we accept that we should measure poverty or inequality with consumption, if we want to have an idea about whether welfare, well-being, inequality has increased, maybe we should look at the U part. So incorporating also things like the quality of consumption on top of the quantity, incorporating other items like leisure, and I'm really being very modest here because, of course, you can put a lot of other things in the utility function like interpersonal comparisons, etc. But I'm going to keep it very simple. And the issue is important because the data show that even if we stop at these two elements, there is increasing disparities in consumption, but actually the distribution of leisure time is becoming more equal, as I'm going to show you by looking at time use data. So I guess this is not an audience where I have to give you the usual reasons why there are cases in which people might prefer using consumption rather than income as a measure of inequality or poverty. There is the theoretical appeal because we're looking at long-term measure of well-being or welfare if consumption is equal to permanent income. The disadvantages, of course, is that the theoretical appeal is lost if people don't follow the theory, or if credit markets don't work to smooth consumption when income is very volatile or transitory. And then there are two important measurement issues. The bottom, the C that appears in that function is consumption, but what we measure in surveys is typically spending. And then there are problems related to the fact that it's very hard to measure in general consumption, all the elements of consumption. So the question is whether the measure of consumption inequality, even if we manage to get good measures of consumption, kind of replicate trends in income inequality, whether they differ and whether these differences are reliable. And the kind of soft spot here is that the data that we have available in the US or other countries for measuring consumption are not extremely rich. The samples are typically smaller than the one that we have for income. And so the two main data sets that we use for this research are the ones that typically researchers use, the CX, the Consumer Expenditure Survey, and the PSID. What we kind of lack in the consumption area is administrative sources. So for income, we have Social Security data, the W2 universe, the IRS data, which are now becoming increasingly available to researchers. But for consumption, we don't have an equivalent. So the closest you can get are data sets that are either not representative of the population or not representative of all the goods that people consume. So scanned data, you have very precise measurements to the units and the prices, etc., but it's only food, typically. There are countries like Denmark or Norway where people pay a tax on wealth. So you have very accurate tax records on income and wealth. You can reconstruct, making heroic assumption about capital gains and losses. You can reconstruct the measure of consumption. Or recently, researchers have had the opportunity to access information from financial softwares like Mint.com or credit card data, where you observe like a snapshot of what people consume with the obvious limitation that you don't see the cash transaction, etc., which may be relevant, of course, in the poverty area. Now, when does measurement of consumption becomes a problem? When we would like to have C, but we have X. And there are at least 4 reasons why C may differ from X, and these are all important, and sometimes even having good measure doesn't solve the problem because you need some theory, like in point 3 here. So spending includes purchases of durables, but we don't want that. We want the flows that we get from these durables, and this may be very hard if you don't have information on the stocks. Some of the consumption is received in kind, obviously transfers from the government, the food stamps, the Medicaid, etc. Some consumption is home produced with other goods and time, like childcare. And this is very hard to measure in data unless you have some idea how the home production works. And the same spending actually may be consistent with dramatically different amount of consumption if the prices that people face are very different. And so there is a big question in the literature of whether the poor pay actually lower prices or higher prices for the goods they consume, and whether things like international trade or Walmart is arriving to town, etc., is actually favoring a reduction of prices in the goods that the poor consume relatively more than the rich. Measurement issues are actually, there is a big debate on the measurement of whether the data we use are very accurate. Researchers may still prefer using income-based measures of poverty relative to consumption-based measures of poverty because perhaps it's easier to measure income. It's just a number on the paycheck. Than consumption, which involves looking at all the shopping activities you've done over a period, etc. Now, there might be cases where that's not actually true, like, for example, Mayer and Sullivan have a paper where they discuss that actually in certain segments of the population, particularly the poor, actually consumption may be more accurate than income because income consists of a myriad of different elements, including transfers which are severely underreported. So this is a little bit of a litany of complaints about the CX. So the CX has a growing detachment from national accounts. It may be less severe in areas that we care about, like the consumption of food or shelter, and maybe less severe if one looks at comparable items relative to the national accounts. These differences, these underreporting would not be a problem if it was kind of randomly distributed across the income distribution, but evidence points to the presence of non-classical measurement errors. So the underreporting is more severe at the top, so this may give you an impression of lower inequality in consumption than actually exists. And indeed, if we kind of trace a little bit of the history of what the papers that have been published on this topic have said over the years, you start from, there's a very dramatic shift in the narrative about how consumption inequality has grown relative to the well-documented rise in income inequality. So some earlier papers pointed out consumption inequality growing very little, almost not at all, over a period of interest. So papers like Slesnik, Kruger, and Perry had this argument, although Cadwell and Katzer were kind of pointing in the opposite direction. The current belief is that if you start paying a little bit attention to the measurement issues that come from the CX and try to be a little bit ingenious or inventive about how to use alternative sources of data, or combining perhaps different components of the CX where some goods are better measured and some are less well measured, then you get a completely different picture. A picture is something like in this graph. So the bottom line was the consensus in the 90s, and the top line is, I think, the common belief that consumption inequality has been growing more and probably as much as income inequality. And the differences between these different papers is just trying to solve in a number of ways, different ways, the problem of measurement that we have in the consumer expenditure survey. Now, even with this evolution of the narrative, if you look within certain types of commodities, you actually start thinking about the importance, for example, of the quality of the prices or the difference between consumption and spending. So here is just one item, is food. The top line is spending. There is increasing inequality over the period for which we have data. This is the 90/10 differential, log differential. Now, the line in the middle is inequality after you add the monetary equivalent of the food stamps. So now there is evidence for much lower inequality, and it's particularly pronounced actually in the period of the Great Recession. So food stamps apparently did a good job in that for that particular in that particular area. And the bottom line is a very modest attempt to take into account the differences in prices. So price differential, relative prices for food at home and food away from home they're very different in this period, and in particular, the price at home, for food at home, were in relative terms declining relative food away from home. And it's important because we're talking about necessities, which are typically consumed by the poor, versus luxuries that are not. But the argument then gets a little bit more complicated once you think about, okay, what is food? So inequality in spending is higher. If you look at consumption, it's a little bit lower. But if you consider, as many economists have done, what food is, let's say, caloric intake, there is not much evidence of a rising inequality in the amount of calories that the food actually value. So there is a research agenda that economists like Aguiar and Hurst have pushed, showing that even if spending may differ, the caloric intake doesn't. And Singh et al. Have a paper in which they show that there isn't much of a difference between the energy intake for people below the poverty line and people above the 500% poverty line. And the argument is that the prices of certain items is lower, so spending doesn't give you like a conversion in terms of energy. But then the different qualities of the food that are purchased gives you some thoughts, because should we assess inequality on the basis of the monetary cost, on the consumption, on the energy intake, or some other quality measure like the health, some health component? And there is an interesting, this is an interesting graph. So if we convert the energy of the food that people buy into something like a health eating index, which is used by the Department of Health and Human Services, which just assign a score to the food that you buy, then there is a little bit of progress visible for people in the high socioeconomic status group, but for the low socioeconomic status, it's basically flat. So this is one simple example in which the quality, as opposed to the quantity, or the energy intake, gives a completely different picture. And we can say something about durables as well. So this is durables ownership in different categories. So there is a picture of convergence over time in the fraction of people who own different types of durables in the top and the bottom income decile. This is true for, the top left is the ownership of availability of some cooking tools, like a stove or a microwave, or fridges or dishwashers, etc. So the picture is one of convergence. But of course, this doesn't tell you anything about the quality or the quantity of these items. And if you look at shelter, you have an even more complicated picture, because the fraction of people who are classified as having shelter and utility costs that are not affordable, so more than 30% of their total budget, is increasing. This is all relative to the bottom decile of the income distribution. But on the right, you have, if you want to have some measure of the quality of the housing that you are consuming, the CX doesn't have a lot of information. I'm using here the fraction of people who live in particular living arrangements like a project or a mobile home. And the picture, of course, is not one of increasing quality, but if we have an image of low quality associated with these living arrangements, of course, it's decreasing. Now, the last thing that I want to say is something about the L in the UCL, the leisure part. So is it the case that increasing inequality in spending is actually matched by increasing equality in leisure? And this seems to be the picture. So if you use Time Use Survey for the period 65 to 2011 and classify as leisure these three categories: personal care, active leisure, so doing sport or something like that, and passive leisure, sitting in front of the TV, or smoking weed is a favorite. Then the picture is that there is increasing leisure for all groups, but if you classify people by permanent income, and here's just whether you have more or less than high school, the picture is one of increasing leisure time available for people with lower education, and this is particularly pronounced for males. And this is particularly driven by, if you cut into these three categories, it's particularly driven by the passive leisure component, so the sitting in front of, so being a potato couch. Now, some of this leisure, of course, is involuntary, lack of job opportunities, even though there is a category work that includes time devoted to job search, but at the same time, you can have the discourage effect creeping in. This picture doesn't change if you exclude the years in which there is a recession or you try to control for people being unemployed. So it seems like some technology, new technology that reduces the amount of time you devote to work for completing a task, or perhaps the availability of durables that actually save a lot of time in the kitchen around the house may be responsible for this increasing leisure. So the general point here is the one I said at the beginning. So if we want to have a complete picture of inequality in welfare, probably we want to go beyond just the quantity and looking at the other things that you want to put in utility function on top of the